Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for sticking through all of the presentations post-lunch. It's always the tough session for everyone. There's been some fantastic conversation. I've learned a lot. I think we're all on this journey on realizing the role that digital can play to help with sustainability goals. And it was great to hear Andreas talk about the twin transition. It's almost like you set up part of my talk there, it's so for just a show of hands, how many of you know about the digital catapult? Oh, good. It's a good mix. It's usually, I usually fail on that where everybody seems to know who we are. So amongst some of the other sister catapults that are here in the room today, the Digital Catapult is a deep tech innovation organization. We, much like all the other catapults in the room, we partner with different parts of industry. We partner with academia. We help basically businesses grow by applying deep tech. The idea is that we also partner with government at the national, regional, and local levels to find solutions to address some of the grand challenges that we're facing. We're effectively about 300 innovators strong. We have a central office here in London, but we've got an incredibly large presence in the Northeast, which I think Anju was really pleased to see showcased recently at one of our regional tech festivals. We also have a growing presence in the Southwest and a new digital twin hub in Northern Ireland. So if that's of interest to people, that's just coming online, and we're starting to build expertise around that hub in that space. And the way we do this is we deliver acceleration and innovation programs, we build testbed facilities, run pilots, proof of concepts, and partner on R&D projects and help with policy recommendations. So up in the Northeast, because I'm very proud of the region that we're in, we've got 2 sites that function as testbeds. One is a state-of-the-art advanced media production facility. How many of you have heard of advanced media production or virtual production before? The 2 of you can't talk. You've both been to our center. But anyway, thank you for that. But essentially, if any of you have watched Mandalorian, or if you've watched Barbie, a lot of the environments that you're seeing at the back, it's significantly, and I'm doing this no justice when I describe it like this, significantly fancier green screen technology, right? So instead of having a green screen where in post-production you're putting an image at the back, you're essentially creating, using game engine technology, a virtual environment that an actor can interact with in real time, a director can change on the fly, through the use of AI tools. So we've got a fantastic production studio in Gateshead, which a lot of people wouldn't realize. As an example of one of the things that we've done with a company in that studio is we've actually created a virtual environment that allows for spatial computing to track movement between the real and virtual worlds. It allows you to control things virtually within the environment. So say you're in a manufacturing space and you're wearing the headset at home and you're linked to the sensors that are in the actual manufacturing site. You want to switch something off, you switch it off, and it switches it off at the site. So there's all sorts of demos that we have available for people to understand the application of that technology. So as I said, we bring together an enterprising community to solve big challenges. Since 2018, we've supported 3,000 companies, and we currently have over 70 active projects. I just wanted to pause here for a second because I think we do need to recognize, I think, Steve, it was you who acknowledged that there's some fantastic capability within universities in terms of the expertise that people bring. And I think we need to acknowledge that. And, equally with the innovators amongst the small companies in the UK, as well as the startups that are now starting to operate in these different spaces. There's some key statistics that actually say there's a lot of expertise in the UK that we're perhaps not harnessing to its highest potential to help address some of these big challenges, particularly around sustainability. And now we move on to the twin transition idea. And this is where we're working with a lot of businesses, really, to get them to think about transitioning to aligning their digital and sustainability strategies. Now, with the push for a transition to a green economy, there is a push to have the transition to a green economy almost sits strategically intertwined with that. And it has been found that companies that align their digital and sustainability strategies not only help increase their efficiencies, they're potentially, in fact, the research that was done by Accenture showed that they're 2.5 times more likely to have a stronger performance over 10 years. But then equally, they're feeding back into the environment, they're feeding back into the society, and providing more value for the economy as well. So the way we're approaching the use of digital technology to combat climate change at Digital Catapult is to help provide tools to businesses that allow them to optimize their processes, allow them to be more transparent. So Andrew, to your point, in terms of digital passports, creating digital spines, helping them become more resource efficient and therefore more resilient because they're allowed to become, they're allowing themselves to be more adaptive and responsive. And I'm going to focus mostly on supply chains because so it's a bit more of a macro approach versus the rest of the conversations that I think we've had, where there's been a focus on formulation and polymer development to really think about that supply chain in the development of the polymers, but equally supply to the users of the polymers, right? And the way we think about it is in terms of an actual digitization of the industrial supply chain, and I'll draw on some examples from our digital supply chain hub, where we promote the use of data both from an individual level to the system level, and we've got some experimental test beds that we're currently running at the minute. Security and trust. So this is about thinking about technology to share that data in a manner that can be trusted, that it's not been changed at the point of transaction between one supplier to the next. Equally, starting to think about how you create new models for provenance of goods, energy, and content. And therefore, the things that we can actually achieve through this is optimization, which is incredibly important for supply chain operations. The United States currently is facing a supply chain crisis with 50 ports currently on strike. So in terms of actually having some of that data to help move things around, it would make things more resilient. Using secure technologies like digital ledger technologies or blockchain, as it's known, to actually create transparency when sharing data, and then of course sustainability, which is thinking about sustainable consumption, and then also helping to create new creative economies. So I'm just going to pause just to tell you a little bit about the Digital Supply Chain Hub, which is live. It's part of the Made Smarter movement. A lot of you would probably be familiar with Made Smarter, which has been working to really encourage the adoption of digital technologies by manufacturers and by other organizations within supply chains in order to make them more efficient, resilient, and sustainable. And supply chains covered really nearly every industry, and I don't need to say that to this room. They cover every aspect of our life, all industries from life sciences to consumer goods to chairs, because that's the example I can think of at the minute, and batteries. And so it's clearly still top of the agenda for business and government in the UK. So when we think about the end-to-end supply chain, and we think about all of the tiers that are involved in the supply chain, the level of complexity that we start to see when you're the brand or the retailer tier 0 to warehousing, to assembly, to manufacturing, to primary production, and cutting across all geographies, the potential for different value that can be created by the adoption of digital at each of those tiers is interlinked, but equally has its own proposition. So for example, I should have just gone through. So if we were to think about the supply chain visibility first, if you are at the center as a brand, you usually have a limited supply chain visibility to a small number of factories. The tier 1, which is where we're currently at, has even further visibility of what the producers at tier 2 and tier 3 have. And then sometimes you have no awareness of that original raw material and the provenance of that raw material. So coming back to the point of that data that's required for digital passporting, the current state essentially is there's no reach or visibility, no relationships, perhaps more importantly, no trust, because without trust, that sharing of data is going to become incredibly hard, and there's no aligned incentives at the minute. So the outcome for that is there's opacity, there's chaos, there's inefficiency, and therefore we can't really work on any of the sustainability impacts that we're all trying to address. In particular, at the tier 4 level, it's been found that 66% of the societal impact and environmental impact happens at that primary producer level, at that raw material level. So if we're thinking about carbon offset, water, waste, biodiversity, that's really where we have no idea even of the level of impact, because that's just not visibility that a supply chain has if you're sat at the top of the food chain there. We think about tier 2 and tier 3, it's been found that 20% of the environmental risks sort of exist in this space, and it's very difficult to see what kind of impact it has on performance, because again, you've got that limited visibility from that tier 4 of when things come in to tier 2 and tier 3. And then ultimately, tier 1, you'll see that where you are at tier 0 as a brand, you have an improved relationship, but you still have significant social and commercial risks. You have to think about labor rights, you have to think about safety standards, you have to think about seasonality curves. And again, all of that is dependent on data that you may not actually ever have line of sight of. So part of what we're trying to do with the Digital Supply Chain Hub is create a digitized end-to-end visibility of data across all of those tiers, right? So then you could start to address some of these different impacts. Boop. So the goal ultimately is to create an integrated end-to-end digital supply chain that meets the needs of all of those stakeholders across those 4 tiers. And you could imagine that this is really complex, and understanding and aligning as incentives to collaborate is fundamental to such a program. Events, users, system interactions, touch points, data types, data that exists on paper, data that exists in Excel sheets, data that exists on potentially floppy disks in some cases because it's old data, right? Thinking about all of that and how it should be shared across that end-to-end stage requires a degree of interaction and people signing up to the fundamental principles of transparency across that supply chain. So the opportunity that we think this creates is that advanced technology gives you the ability to create better information, which therefore allows for that further transparency. Better information, therefore, then leads to better decisions. And then better decisions improve the value and the flow of materials and money. And then ultimately, better efficiency opens up the opportunity for improved sustainability. So really that narrative of twin transition at that fundamental level for businesses to buy in. Because what we found, particularly working with small and medium-sized enterprises, is they're not necessarily thinking about sustainability goals unless it's regulatory enforced. It's about keeping the lights on. It's about making sure they can pay people. It's about making sure they can get product out the door. So how do you get that buy-in from people? So over the last 2 years, there are 4 test beds that have been running across different sectors. And I'm just going to pull this up to make sure I remember the sectors correctly. There's a food supply chain. There is a hydrogen supply chain. And there is a textile supply chain. And last but not the least, there is a spare parts supply chain. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the spare parts supply chain, which is a consortium between NBT Group, which is based up in the Northeast. I'm going to use all Northeast examples today if I can. Vitech Solutions, which is a technology provider. Womble Bond Dickinson, which is a law firm. So thinking about that transaction, thinking about that trust, thinking about that accountability, and the Northeast Automotive Alliance, and Troy. The university partner here is Northumbria University, so bringing in those experts, in terms of the technology expertise. It really represents a consortium of people that have signed up to that trust and sharing of data. Now, what this particular supply chain is focused on is creating a testbed environment which will enable modeling of the spare parts supply chain to test AI and other emerging technology solutions to deliver more sustainable business, but equally deliver performance improvement. And what it'll do, it is actually support the development of a sector-agnostic digital twin of the entire spare parts supply chain. And that will be made available to any interested party who wants to play with it, test with it. Equally, NBT is using this testbed to think about how to measure Scope 3 emissions and across the entire supply chain. So it will effectively allow people to model it will effectively allow for modeling, which will evaluate measures and the effects of collaboration across each of those tiers of the supply chain, and therefore will then allow you to make better decisions around sustainability. Just wanted to get some of those details right, so apologies for reading off that. So, a few other ways in which we talk to businesses, because again, a lot of this is about how do we get a business to adopt the digital tool, particularly if they're a small and medium-sized enterprise. And I'm going to use the Northeast again as an example. 90% of our businesses are small and medium-sized, right? So really getting them to engage is important. So the example that we use in terms of order optimization, business as usual, means that the business is optimizing its own business inventory levels without really talking to anybody else in the supply chain to achieve 2 to 5% gains. The impact of that is that the efficiency is substantially lower than it could be. When the pallet arrives, it takes 3 times longer to break down, restock. However, if it was actually talking to the suppliers, if it was actually talking to the stores, in terms of what's the minimum order quantity, and used that data to create an AI tool to optimize orders to meet that quantity for pick, pack, and logistics between buyers and suppliers, that would ultimately result in an 18% cost reduction in pick, pack, and ship, and a reduction in energy consumption because they're not having to bring the trucks in at different times and are much more efficient in their process, right? So that's one of the examples that really resonates with small businesses. Similarly, supply-demand balancing, forecasting is 86% accurate, and that's business as usual, resulting in either empty shelves or downgrades for a company. There's a large amount of waste and poor visibility of supply of key commodities, which reduces resilience for the company. A solution, again, if we were to use AI in that, for proper planning, it could actually improve the accuracy to 98% accuracy for both the retailer and for the manufacturer. These are all real examples. I've just had to anonymize them. Apologies. And then the business value ultimately becomes a 27% reduction in downgrades, 30% reduction in waste, and a 9% improvement in availability, right? And then carbon accounting through a digital spine. So business as usual, a large, fast-moving goods consumer company has a complex, fragmented supply chain, operating in silos, limiting the amount of information that can be shared. The impact of that is there's a lack of accountability or incentives for carbon reduction. Solution is a digital spine to provide open access to carbon emissions data and a cohesive infrastructure that can be jointly governed as well as operate on behalf of the ecosystem. And the potential business value, again, comes down to life cycle assessments being completed in a much more efficient way, and then industry customers can obtain the data they need to support low carbon procurement practices. So again, all examples of things that have been done in the past. 2 more examples where I could share some more details. So this is an example where we put out an open call. So a challenge was framed by Sainsbury's just in terms of pork supply chain. And we worked with Singular Intelligence to develop an AI-based decision engine to improve sale forecasts with Cranswick by sensing demand for better planning. The solution assesses the supply risk, it predicts future imbalance, and therefore it improves overall sales and operations efficiency. Similarly, thinking about product carbon footprints, and Chris, I'm looking at you because this is another Unilever-sponsored project, right? Suppliers and customers don't always get or use the same identification schemes for product carbon footprints, which I'm sure is something all of you are facing. So while it's still in its infancy and it's rapidly scaling, the PACT implementation program was engaged to share over 1,300 of these product carbon footprints. Now, most company emissions are in the supply chains, requiring accurate sort of calculation through their supply chain and exchange of this product carbon footprint to manage their greenhouse gas emissions. So, sponsored by Unilever and working with industry bodies like PACT and GS1 and DEFRA, so I think I saw someone from DEFRA here this morning as well, we put out a challenge to invite startups and SMEs to respond and create solutions for storing and exchanging these product carbon footprints. And as part of this, They're using AI, they're using distributed ledger technology and advanced identity solutions. This is not complete yet, so I don't have the solutions, but I think it's well worth being aware that this work is happening in this space. And now I'm going to pivot, because one of the things that, and Anju and I have talked about this a lot, is we can't talk about solving these grand challenges and getting people to adopt new technologies to solve grand challenges without having a grown-up conversation on skills and the impact that it has on a workforce. Because every time you adopt a new piece of technology in your supply chain, you adopt a new piece of technology for your business, there's a fundamental disruption to the way work is done, to the way the supply chain is going to operate. And therefore, that's going to need new capabilities to be developed as an organization. So a workforce is going to have to think about how to address those needs that are going to come maybe 12 to 18 months down the line. So we all recognize there are skill shortages now, but what we, as the Catapult Network, and I think there's a few, I think CPI has participated in this exercise as well, is we've been partnering with Innovate UK on an initiative called the Workforce Foresighting Hub, where we've been working with educators, employers, and technologists to really start to identify the organizational capabilities and workforce skills that will be necessary with the adoption of these new technologies. So just a quick bit about that. It's built on this idea of the skills value chain. So where we are is we're foresighting future workforce capability. We're starting to define new roles, define new occupations, define new standards with those roles, because we're fundamentally changing the way the workforce is going to be operating. So it's a structured process to develop insight and recommendations that are required for industry, policymakers, and educators to adapt to the continuing change that these advanced digital technologies will bring. So remember I talked about that virtual production network? So we've actually undertaken what are called cycles with the hub within our advanced media production space. So if, for example, we were creating a digital twin of a manufacturing space, not of a, a polymer or a design of a particular solution, but of a manufacturing space. And we were using the advanced media production tools to enable that to happen, where fundamentally now, with the use of game engine technology and with the use of AI, changing the way that production happens, right? All of a sudden, the capabilities that you need in post-production aren't as important as what you need in pre-production. All of a sudden, you require your workforce to have a basic understanding of AI. It requires a makeup artist to understand how, that technology is going to interact with the makeup that they've put on that actor, right? So it's fundamentally disrupting the way things work. So in order to try and map some of that, we, in collaboration with the Workforce Foresighting Hub, we ran a series of workshops where we got input from technologists, from employers, and from the educators, and that includes the tertiary education system, so higher education and further education, because there's a lot of work that is happening in further education as well in this space. So we got expert input. We then took data input alongside the Foresighting Hub from national and global data sets around occupational standards. So this is ONS data. It's data on apprenticeship standards that basically has been put into a data lake, or as they call it, a data cube, to generate reports on future supply chain capabilities, to generate ideas on what are the capabilities or the future roles that we need to be designing for. So we prototype occupational profiles and fundamentally start to change the language that we're using, because equally, someone who's a game engine designer for production may have the same skills that are needed by someone who's creating a digital twin in the chemicals industry. So it's about creating that common taxonomy of capabilities that are required that come with this adoption of advanced technologies. So through our 2 cycles, what we've actually identified is 16 future occupational profiles that we need to be thinking about that are fundamentally different in terms of how capabilities should be developed. There's 124 future capabilities that have been identified through these exercises that our current apprenticeship standards just don't prepare people for. So what can we be doing to start thinking about not redesigning full apprenticeship standards, but what can we be doing to start supplementing as short courses, as workshops that sit alongside that to start to prepare people for this. So as part of that, we actually partnered with Northumbria University, and we were working on developing a master's program for digital and immersive arts. We were actually able to feed a lot of this learning into that to try and start addressing some of those elements. We've developed workshops in our advanced media production studio in Gateshead that actually try and upskill small companies and startups now as they start thinking about the use of this technology. We're about to embark on our third cycle. If anybody's interested in quantum sensors or works in the critical infrastructure or navigation space, please do come have a chat. But just on that, hopefully that's just a little snapshot of what we're trying to do in terms of adoption of digital technology and how it might address some of the sustainability goals of the future. And I'll stop there.